Welcome back. Welcome back to Letting Go. This is chapter 6, Fear. I apologize for the long break in between reading, but these long chapters where I sit and read for an hour, about 30 minutes in, it just becomes I'm slugging it out. It's not very enjoyable. So I'm gonna this chapter I'm going to split it in half. I'm gonna make two parts, and um, yeah, I'm gonna try doing that just to make it a little easier on me. Make it so I enjoy it a little more, and hopefully maybe you enjoy it a little more. We'll find out. But here we go. This is chapter 6, Fear. The many faces of fear are familiar to us all. We have felt free floating anxiety and panic. We have been paralyzed and frozen by fear, with its accompanying uh, palpitations and apprehension. Worries are chronic fears. Paranoia is its extreme. In milder forms of fear, we are merely uneasy. When it is more severe, we become scared, cautious, blocked, tense, shy, speechless, superstitious, defensive, distrustful, threatened, insecure, dreading, suspicious, timid, trapped, guilty, and full of stage fright. There is fear of pain and suffering, fear of living, fear of loving, fear of closeness, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of God, fear of hell, fear of damnation, fear of poverty, fear of ridicule and criticism, fear of being trapped, fear of inadequacy, fear of danger, fear of disapproval, fear of boredom, fear of responsibility, fear of making a decision, fear of authority, fear of punishment, fear of change, fear of loss or security, fear of loss of security, fear of violence, fear of losing control, fear of feelings themselves, fear of manipulation, fear of being found out, fear of heights, fear of sex, fear of being on our own and being responsible, and fear of fear itself. There is, moreover, a cause of fear of which many people are unaware: the fear of retaliation. This fear arises from the desire to strike out, to hit back, to attack, and we let go of fear. We find that behind it, there is often anger at the object of fear itself. The willingness to let go of the fear and overcome it already moves us up to the next level, which is anger. The fact that we can face this combination of fear, anger feelings, and surrender it moves us instantly up to pride and courage. One excellent experiment is to let go of the fear of fear itself. When we stop being afraid of fear, we notice that it is just a feeling. In fact, fear is far more tolerable than depression. Surprisingly, to a person who has been in bad depression, the reemergence of fear is welcomed. It is better to feel scared than hopeless. To understand how fear is self reinforcing, we have to stop and look at one another. To understand how fear is self reinforcing, we have to stop and look at another one of the laws of consciousness. What one holds in mind tends to manifest. What this means is that any thought which we consistently hold in mind and consistently give energy to will tend to come into our life according to the very form in which our mind has held it. Thus, fear engenders fearful thoughts. The more we hold these thoughts in mind, the more likely the feared event will happen in our life, which again reinforces our fear. As a medical intern, there was a fear of public speaking. At the very thought of getting up in front of medical colleagues to present a patient's case, the voice would fail out of sheer fright. Because of holding that fear, the inevitable situation arose that necessitated having to present the case of a patient to the staff meeting. After reading a few paragraphs of the case history, the voice began to falter and get weaker and eventually stopped. The very fear that had been held in mind came to pass, and of course, that occurrence reinforced a fear of public speaking and brought on apathy about it. Henceforth, for many years, the limiting belief system operated: I can't speak in public, I'm just not a public speaker. Any and all speaking occasions were avoided, with the consequent loss of self esteem, avoidance of activities, and limitation of vocational goals. As the years passed, the fear took a somewhat different form. The belief system was: I don't want to speak because I might be a boring and bad speaker. Finally, an occasion arose where it was necessary to speak in a public meeting. There was the opportunity to sit down and find the courage to face the fear. The inner dialogue was: what's the worst possible thing that could happen? Well, you could be terribly boring. This brought to mind all the boring speeches given by others, and then it became possible to accept that a boring speech was actually common and certainly not the end of the world. There was a letting go of the pride and vanity behind that fear. Yes, it just might happen that the speech would be terribly boring. The fateful day finally arrived. The paper was written out so that all that was needed was to read it. Yes, it would have been far more interesting to give extreme to give it extemporaneously. I don't know. But there was an acknowledgement and acceptance of the fear, and so the speech was written out beforehand. The moment arrived to ascend the podium. Despite the inner fear in reading the speech in a flat, monotone voice, the feat was accomplished. Afterwards, some friends said, that was technically a good paper, but boy, it sure was boring. The inner self, however, didn't care. It was jubilant that there had been the courage and acceptance to face the situation and actually do it. The fact that it was boring was irrelevant. What was important was that it was done at all. Self esteem increased because the fear and inhibition had been overcome, and speaking engagements no longer had to be avoided. In fact, the practice developed to begin all presentations with a warning to the audience: I am one of the most boring speakers around, and in fact, I can be quite tedious. Surprisingly, this brought a laugh from the audience. Their laughter signified acceptance of our common humanness, and so the fears were lifted. It was discovered that humor is invaluable in public speaking. It is a way of just being at one with the humanness of the audience and discovering their compassion. Once we are united with them in compassion, we can feel their encouragement as they cheer us on. We love them for relieving our fear and accepting us, and they love us back for doing the very thing that they themselves fear. Once this evolution through the levels of emotion is made, there is an enjoyment of public speaking. We find out that part of the mind can be quite funny when the occasion arises. Eventually, with complete surrender, reading a prepared speech dropped off and the speaking became extemporaneous. With more experience, the public speaking improved, which engendered more speaking engagements. This allowed the accomplishment of many vocational goals that heretofore had been thwarted. There were appearances in the national media, such as talk shows on television. It is a long step from being too frightened even to read a case history in front of a few interns to enjoying one self speaking on a television network to millions of viewers on the Barbara Walters show. We all derive great benefit from liberating ourselves out of a fearful inhibition into successful functioning, because that learning process automatically spills over into many other areas of our life. We become more capable, freer, and happier. With that, there is an inner peace of mind. The healing effect of love, the fear, the healing effect of love is a sub chapter or like section. Fear is so pandemic in our society that it constitutes the predominant ruling emotion of our world as we know it. Fear was also the predominant emotion among the thousands of patients treated during the decades of clinical practice. Fear is so extensive and takes so many forms that there are not enough pages in this book to enumerate all of its varieties. Fear is associated with our survival, and so it is given a special accord in our minds. For most people, fear is so all pervasive that their life really constitutes one giant set of compensatory devices to conquer their fears. However, even this does not suffice, so the media present us over and over again with fearful situations, as in this morning's news, terrorist group threatens to poison our food supply. Such headlines are constant, and though to give the mind further opportunities to master that most dreaded of all emotions, as the lyrics of the song put it, we are caught between a fear of living and a fear of dying. When all the mind's compensatory devices fail and fear spills forth into consciousness, an overt anxiety attacks or phobias. The person is labeled as having anxiety neurosis. It is informative to note that the tranquilizer Valium is the best selling drug in America. Fear tends to escalate, thus, the typical patient with phobias shows a progressive extension of the fear into more and more avenues of life, leading to further and further restrictions of activity, and in severe cases, to total immobilization. This was the case of a patient named Betty. Betty was 34 years old, but she looked much older because she was thin and drawn. She entered the office carrying armloads of paper bags, which were later found to contain 56 different bottles of health store preparations, vitamins, nutritional supplements, plus several bags of special food. Her fear had started out as a germ phobia, soon everything around her seemed to be possibly contaminated with germs. She had many fears of contagious contracting contagious diseases, which had progressed now to a fear of cancer. She believed every scare story she read, so she was afraid of nearly every food, the air she breathed, and getting sunshine on her skin. She wore white clothes because she was afraid of dyes in the materials. In the office, she would never sit down because she was afraid that the chair might be contaminated. Whenever she needed a prescription, she asked that it be written from the middle of the prescription pad, which had not been touched. Furthermore, she wanted to tear the page from the pad herself. She didn't want me to touch it because possibly I had gotten germs from shaking hands with the last patient. She wore white gloves at all times. She requested to be treated by telephone as she was too afraid of making the trip to the office again. The following week on the telephone, she said that she was afraid to get up. She would call from home while still in bed because now she was afraid to go out on the streets. She had developed a fear of muggers, rapists, and air pollution. At the same time, she was afraid to stay home in bed for fear that she might get worse, and to compound all her other fears, she was afraid that she was losing her mind. She was afraid that the medication wouldn't help her and that it might have side effects. But she was afraid not to take it for fear she would not get better. Now, she said that she had a fear that she might choke on the pills and had stopped taking even her health pills, much less the prescribed medication. Her fears were so paralyzing that every therapeutic maneuver was totally stemmed? Stymied? I don't know. She wouldn't allow me to talk to her family. She was afraid they would find out that she was seeing a psychiatrist and think she was crazy. I was totally baffled and racked my brain for weeks on how I could possibly help her. Finally, I let go. I experienced the relief of surrender in that I just totally gave up. There is absolutely nothing I can do to help her. The only thing left to do is just to love her. And so that's what I did. I just thought of her lovingly, and frequently I sent her loving thoughts. I gave her as much love as I could possibly give when we talked on the telephone, and finally, after a couple of months of loving therapy, she got sufficiently better to come to the office. As time went on, she improved and her fears and inhibitions began to diminish, though she never did develop any insight. She was too afraid of talking about psychological matters, she said, and so over the months and eventually years of treatment, the only thing I ever did was to love her. This case illustrates a concept that we previously presented in the chapter on apathy. That is, a higher vibration, such as love, has a healing effect on a lower vibration, such as that in the patient's case, fear. This love is the mechanism of reassurance, and very often we can quiet another person's fears by our mere physical presence and by the loving energy that we project to them and with which we surround them. It is not what we say, but the very fact of our presence that has the healing effect. We can learn another one of the laws of consciousness. Fear is healed by love. This is the central theme of the series of books by psychiatrist Jerry Jampolsky. This was also the basis of the healing that went on in the Attitudinal Healing Center in Manhasset, Long Island, of which I was co-founder and medical advisor. Attitudinal healing has to do with group interaction with patients who have fatal and catastrophic illnesses. And the whole process of healing has to do with letting go of fear and replacing it with love. This is the same mechanism of healing demonstrated by the great saints and illuminated healers whose very presence has the power to heal because of the intense vibration of love which they radiate. This healing power, the basis of spiritual healing, is also transmitted by loving thoughts. The multitudes of people down through recorded history who have healed by just this kind of love are legendary. In recent history, for instance, Mother Teresa is credited with healing great numbers of people by these very mechanisms of unconditional love and illuminated presence. To people who are unfamiliar with the laws of consciousness, these types of cures seem miraculous, but to those who are familiar with the laws of consciousness, such phenomena are commonplace and to be expected. High levels of consciousness are in themselves capable of healing, transforming, and enlightening others. The value of the surrendering mechanism is that by letting go of the blocks to love, our capacity to love increases progressively. And loving energy has the capacity to heal ourselves as well as others. The only drawback to these types of healings is that often the healing is sustained while in proximity to a person capable of radiating high levels of love, but the illness returns when people leave that presence, unless they themselves have learned to elevate their own consciousness. Well, you might ask, if sending loving thoughts has a healing power, how come we see all the sick people in hospitals whose families are so salacious? I don't know. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Why does the love of the family not heal the patient? The answer is to look at the kinds of thoughts that are being sent by the family to the patient. As you examine them, you will find that they are primarily thoughts of anguish and fear, accompanied by guilt and ambivalence. We might picture love to be like the sunlight and negative thoughts like the clouds. Whereas our higher, greater self is like the sun, all the negative thoughts, doubts, fears, anger, and resentments that we hold dim the light of the sun. And finally, the light comes through only weakly. It was Jesus Christ who said that we all, with faith, potentially have the power to heal. The saint or person of high consciousness is by definition one who has removed the clouds of negativity and radiates the full healing power of the sun. That is also why saintly beings have such magnetic power, that they attract multitudes to their physical presence. As an example, when the late Indian saint Sri Ramana Maharshi had a birthday, 25,000 people stood in the sweltering tropical sun, shoulder to shoulder, in one solid mass to celebrate his presence and wish him well. As we constantly let go of resisting our fears and allow them to be surrendered, the energy that was tied up in the fear is relinquished and now becomes available to shine forth as the energy of love. Therefore, unconditional love has the greatest power of all, and that love is the power of the celebrated saints. Unconditional love is also the power of the mother and of the father, the presence of whom is so essential to the children's learning to love as they grow. It was Sigmund Freud who observed that the most fortunate thing that can happen to us growing up is to be our mother's favorite child. What about those of us who did not have the fortunate experience of being bathed in unconditional love as we grew up? There is the commonly held belief that if we did not have this experience, then we are somehow scarred or crippled for life. Actually, this is not so. A person who has experienced a great deal of love in early life has fewer fears and a head start, but this love is intrinsic within all of us. By the very nature of being by the very nature of our being and by the very nature of the life energy that flows through us and empowers us to breathe and to think, we all have that same vibrational energy level of love within us. If in looking at ourselves, we see that we have allowed the experience of our own nature to become blocked off by extensive fears, then we can rediscover the love within us by utilizing the mechanism of surrender and thus letting go of the clouds of negativity. By rediscovering this inner love, we rediscover the true source of happiness. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to read the second half of this chapter tomorrow. I thought that was pretty good. That's a good. I feel like that was a good length of time. Yeah, I don't disagree with anything the book said. I'm trying to get better at reading. I don't know. Thanks for watching.